All right, so what is this workshop? We're going to go over some key concepts that we're hoping are going to be really helpful in implementing trans-inclusive pedagogies and creating trans-inclusive classrooms. We're going to go over like strategies and like the how to do this. We keep in mind that people are coming at this from different levels of knowledge and experience. So there is going to be like different tiers of I guess knowledge to this, right? There's going to be some basic information that some folks might be familiar with, some might not, and then we're going to get into some other things that maybe you're less familiar with, and we leave some time at the end to really address any questions that you might have, and to address like whatever your needs are, right? Because we understand that this is, it can be different for different folks. So some things that we want to explore here is, so what is the role of language in fostering trans inclusion? How do our language choices affect trans people? What assumptions require challenging for trans inclusion? And what kind of strategies do trans people and their allies use? So some guidelines that we've created just to facilitate this. Please keep your mics muted until we get to the Q&A section. This is just going to make things easier for all of us. If you have questions during the presentation, please use the chat to do that. And you can post them, and I think Eugene's going to be monitoring that. Yes, okay. There's a few writing exercises that we have in this webinar, so you can write privately, and if you then want to share that with others, you can post them in the chat for discussion. Obviously be respectful and avoid disrespectful language. I think that's pretty. All right, so we're gonna go over, we went over the introduction, or no, we're gonna go over the introduction. Then Eugene's gonna go over why does this matter, and then Jamie's gonna go into challenges and suggestions, and then we're gonna have time for Q&A and discussion at the end. So we're gonna go ahead and get started with terminology and core concepts. The first thing that I would like for everybody to do is to take a couple minutes, let's say 3 minutes, and write, respond to this prompt. So when was the first time that you found out that you're a boy, a girl, whatever gender that you are? When was the first time that you found this out? And how did you find out? It's hard to tell if you need more time to do this or not via Zoom. I guess if you're ready and somebody wants to share, you can type it or unmute yourself, I guess.
And for those of you who did recently join, just a note that we are recording the presentation part of the session. So if you don't want your voice or image on recording, go ahead and mute your microphones. The chat will not be recorded, so you're still free to post there.
Also, we'd be happy to read something from the chat, but we wouldn't include your name.
Yeah, does anybody want to share what you wrote for this?
Amrit.
So actually this one was a really difficult one for me because I don't think that there was ever an exact moment, but in my culture, gender itself is so like ingrained into everything. You know, you can only do certain things if you're a girl or a boy, or, you know, the parents would rather have a boy than a girl, so they kind of treat you differently. So I think I was never really I never really thought about gender because it was always just obvious. You know, you're a girl, so you have to dress this way. You can't go over here. You can't act this way. That type of thing. That's all I got.
Yeah, thank you. That's really helpful. And thank you for sharing. Does anybody else want to share? So the purpose of that exercise is to get people to reflect on their experience of gender. Oftentimes for cis people, you don't really have to think about your gender. You're told something from an early age and you kind of accept it, and maybe it fits for you, and there's no like questioning, or there's not much thought that goes into it because it just kind of fits, and you kind of go along with it. Whereas for trans people, this is often a source of trauma and a source of having to fight and having to like show others who you know yourself to be. And many times, regardless of whether you're cis or trans, many times the way that we find out things about our gender is when we're not doing it correctly, quote unquote. So for example, I've done this exercise. I teach psych of gender, and I do this exercise with my students. And a lot of times what comes up is, well, I was like in kindergarten or in first grade or something like that, you know, very early age. And I wanted to play with the boys, and they told me, and the teachers or somebody told me I can't do that because I'm a girl. Or you know, things, or I wanted to play with this toy and they told me, oh, you can't do that because you're a boy and boys don't play with dolls, things like that. So a lot of times it starts very early on, and we get kind of corrected or told like we're not doing it right. And so that's kind of how gender comes into our consciousness, is through this through these experiences. So the normative system, so there's this sex gender system. In there's actually two different things, right? Two different components here. So one is sex. Sex is assigned at birth, and it's typically male, female, or intersex, and that's usually like what goes in somebody's birth certificate. That is mostly based solely off of external genitalia, right? Like what happens is a baby's born, the doctor has the baby and says, oh, I see a penis, this is a boy. Or I don't see a penis, so this is a girl. So that's all that's based off of. Gender, on the other hand, is somebody's internal sense of who they are. And usually we use words such as man, woman, non-binary. We're expanding our language in terms of like words that describe different genders, but typically those are the most commonly used ones. So as far as one thing I want to say about that is that in Western societies currently, there's been this like confusion of sex and gender, or people have been sort of confounding these terms to mean the same thing, and we're starting to like kind of undo that, but for a long time these were confounded, and that's not the case for everywhere in the world. There are different places in the world, different cultures, and different time periods in which this was not the case. There have been cultures that have third genders throughout history. So it's not, colonialism had a really big investment in confounding sex and gender in order to colonize people. So this is just to say that in Western society, in the time that we're now, this is something that kind of gets confounded, but it hasn't always been the case, and it's not the case everywhere. Biological determinism. So this is the notion that biology determines one's identity, behaviors, and desires. So this idea that like girls act a certain way because they're girls, and that's going to determine their future too. So this is kind of going back to this binary system. And we're taught that gender, sex, and sexuality all exist as binaries, such as for gender, man, woman; for sex, male, female; for sexuality, gay, straight. But obviously we know that isn't true, right? Like that doesn't capture the reality of and the nuance of these different concepts. So the word trans is the current preferred term or language. There have been different terms that people who are trans have used in history. Currently, this is the preferred one. It's an umbrella term for different genders. So, for example, people who are non-binary typically fall within this trans umbrella. Transsexual was a word that was previously used. It's no longer the preferred word that trans people use. And transgendered is also disfavored. Yes, as I mentioned, non-binary genders are included within the trans umbrella. There are some non-binary people who don't use the term, who don't identify as trans. That is like a preference. It could be that maybe they don't see themselves as trans. Anyway, in contrast to cisgender, somebody who's trans is somebody whose gender is different than their sex that they were assigned at birth. Whereas cisgender means somebody whose gender matches the sex they were assigned at birth. So transphobia are beliefs, behaviors, systems that oppress trans people. They range from physical violence, language. There's different ways to enact this oppression towards trans people. So we have some examples here. So making negative comments or overgeneralizing, misgendering, so using the wrong pronoun, name, or other kinds of gender language towards the trans person. Staring, excluding, or questioning the right of trans people to be in gender segregated spaces. Outing somebody as trans. Pressuring a trans person to disclose details about their bodies or histories, asking those like invasive questions. Laughing at or about a trans person's identity or presentation. And the reality is that trans people, we're exposed to this on a daily basis, constantly, right? So this is what this workshop is trying to address, trying to create and help you create classroom spaces that are disrupting this transphobia. So cissexism is treating cis people as the norm or natural, while erasing trans people or treating them as abnormal or unnatural. So this is things like assuming that somebody's cis because they don't look trans. There's no one way to look trans. You have no idea what somebody's gender is, right? Like there's no way for you to know that. Treating sex and gender as the same thing. We know that that's not correct. Using labels such as women or men to equal cis men or cis women. So you're kind of assuming that everybody's cis in that way. Using physical characteristics to categorize a person's gender. And having more difficulty correctly gendering trans people than cis people. And this is something that's pretty ordinary and people do quite frequently, right? So this is something that happens throughout the day. Binaryism is an ideology that reinforces the negative evaluation of gender nonconformity, or this idea that there has to be two genders, right? Like you have to pick one, man or woman. And it's a cultural belief that perpetuates negative judgments of people who do not present as a stereotypical man or woman. And there are practices that colleges and universities use to kind of enforce this gender binary. So most bathrooms are segregated by sex, right? There's a lot of single-sex residence halls and athletic teams. There's facilities that are designated for male-female students only. There's programs and services like Women in STEM and men's Bible studies. And there's nothing inherently wrong with having some of these things. It's just like you have to think about like who are you excluding with this, right? Like who are you leaving out? Where is somebody such as myself who I'm non-binary, like where am I gonna go and how do I know that this is a space in which I can be included if you're calling something Women in STEM or things like that, you know? So what the consequences of this, what ends up happening is that students who are transitioning or who are non-binary, they have to demonstrate their fitness for certain facilities and program that corresponds to their affirmed sex. So you're asking people to disclose information to prove things that it poses an added layer of pressure, of trauma, of stress that other people don't have to deal with. And now Eugene's gonna talk to you about why this matters.
Thanks, Sam. That was great. I just want to remind people that the beauty of Zoom and having your cameras off means that you can stretch and take care of yourself during this presentation. So I know that I get tight sitting on a computer all day. So if you need to take some time to stretch out your body, that'd be great. So on the second part of this, we're talking about why does it matter? So I'll be giving information about the trans community in the university system specifically. And we'd like to give a content warning that we're talking about statistics dealing with transphobic violence and the physical, emotional repercussions that follow from that. So the first thing we want to talk about is virtual considerations. Especially at UCSB, we've gone virtual. Everything is on Zoom or on GauchoSpace. So because of this, and there are some actual physical considerations to think about. Many students have moved home in light of the campus closing. This means that many trans, non-binary, and queer students are cohabitating with unaccepting parents, families, or communities. They are existing in spaces that are emotionally or physically violent and traumatic, and this will impact academic performance. What this might look like in practice would be inattentiveness, distractedness, or outright neglect of students doing these inside of your classrooms. So if you're noticing, just like you would in a physical classroom, that students are being inattentive, not doing work that they're supposed to be doing, check in on them when you can. Offer support and understanding, and be flexible with grading options, due dates, and deadlines. This is a thing we've been talking about, especially with this sudden transition to online forum. And if you are teaching any courses, you will know that you are given 12 hours to transition your winter quarter into online and a week to go online for spring. So it's been, for all of us who are teaching, quite the experience of trying to make everything happen at once. And for students, this is a new learning environment. You might not have space away from your families to do these things. So flexibility for everyone is really key in this. And also this idea of radical care for each other and checking in, making sure how people are doing as part of your teaching practices. The National Center for Transgender Equality reports 1 in 5 trans people experience houselessness or homelessness. This number is likely exacerbated by COVID-19. And also COVID-19 is impacting houselessness populations, specifically in some really terrible ways. So don't assume that your students have stable, reliable, and safe housing. Again, this goes in with checking in with students and making sure that they're okay. Now, another reason why this matters is because trans communities are vulnerable. So trans people in the US face epidemic levels of harassment, abuse, suicide, and poverty. What this looks like is 97% of trans people report mistreatment at work. 41% have attempted suicide. 63% have experienced a serious act of discrimination. 23% of those have experienced 3 or more of these serious acts. And 30% of trans women have been incarcerated. Intersections at this moment are critical. Trans femmes, trans people of color, and visibly trans people receive consistently less favorable treatment and outcomes. And these intersections we can also see when Sam was talking about their definitions. Our ideas of gender and the ways that we experience the world are compounded by these intersections, by ability, race, class, age. All of these things affect how our gender is experienced and how and specifically how trans people are vulnerable in these different ways. Further, trans students themselves are vulnerable. So among trans students who come out in kindergarten through 12th grade, 78% have been harassed and 35% have been assaulted for being trans, 31% harassed by teachers or staff, and nearly 15% dropped out as a result of this mistreatment, 48% of whom later experienced houselessness. 6% of these people were expelled for being trans specifically. And this is particularly poignant under COVID. Idaho's governor just signed in a couple of bills just that like discriminate specifically against trans people. So these aren't going away. In fact, these issues continue to be an issue in our education system and in our system, just in our lives day to day. Suicide attempts are more common among those harassed or assaulted. And in higher ed, 35% of trans people have been harassed and 5% assaulted for being trans. 52% experienced mental health difficulties, things like depression and anxiety, and 2% were expelled for being trans. Just really sad statistics is what I'm giving you. That's my part of the presentation. This also matters because trans students are in your classes. So we've given you the quantitative data. Here's some qualitative data for you for experiences by trans students. So student has reported dreading knowing that instructors will probably read your birth name out loud to the class is extremely stressful and miserable and embarrassing. I don't want the stress and discomfort of constantly educating, reminding, and correcting pronouns. Nobody knows non-binary is a thing. Some of my peers have not been exposed to many gender and sexual minorities before coming here. And be educated and compassionate enough to recognize these identities and create a space where students don't feel scared to be themselves. So what we can see from here are things like dead naming students, so calling them by their birth name rather than the name that they would call themselves, or what just like how anyone would want to report their name, introduce themselves. And then the added onus of education. So we appreciate you all being here to educate yourselves so that your students don't have to do this work on top of their own classwork and their day-to-day lives. So given this context, many trans people will not assume you're an ally. So it's your job to make yourself clear. And then in this third section, we're going to jump to the ways in which you can make these things clear that you are an ally. Take it away, Jamie. Jamie, you're muted.
Thank you for that. I obviously don't know how to work Zoom. Thank you both for that context. So in this section, I'm going to cover some general advice for interacting with and supporting trans students in the classroom. And we're going to work on some language modification, some conflict management, and some syllabus language to help us really create these inclusive environments that we're hoping for. So first, we're just going to start with some general recommendations. So as a general rule, don't assume that you know anything about a person's gender, right? Modify your language to indicate that you are not making these assumptions. So it's just really important to remember that gender and gender identity is not something that is always visible on the body. You cannot tell someone's gender just by looking at them. So keep that in mind. By virtue of us all being in this workshop, I think that we're all really interested in doing our part to make sure that trans and non-binary folk feel safe and included in our classrooms. But the fact is that we don't live in a world in which trans and non-binary students can always be out, right? That they always feel safe being out. It's not always physically or economically safe. So never out a trans person in your class. They may have disclosed to you privately, you may not know for sure, but are suspecting that they are trans or non-binary. Allow them to have the agency and the power in that situation, and be sure not to out anyone without their explicit permission. Assume that you're going to be influenced by cis sexism and transphobia and be vigilant about that. again, this is everywhere. It's all around us, right? This association between sex and gender, the sex-gender system. We're all socialized into that system. And so it's really important to be cognizant of that and to really be thinking critically about the language that you use in those situations. Likewise, sometimes you may not realize that you have done something that has caused a trans or non-binary person harm in some way. If a trans or non-binary person or an ally comes to you and says that something you said or done has been harmful, listen to them, right? Accept that. Assume that they have good reason for being bothered by certain types of language and behavior, and trust their experience in that situation. So those are just some basic ground rules. I'm going to move on to some questions about language here. So our first sort of strategy is to think about words with gendered meanings. So who gets to decide on the meaning or scope of gendered words? And do gendered identities and roles need some sort of stable or objective definition? So in other words, who counts as a man or a woman? How do we know if a body part is, quote, female or male, right? Do we need to know if someone is female or male? Do we need to know the sort of inner workings of someone's gender identity to treat them with respect and kindness, right? So ultimately the question is, who makes these choices? Who shapes these definitions for us in our society? The short answer to this question is that this isn't a matter of need, right? It's a matter of fact. The fact is, gendered identities, like any other social role, just don't have an objective definition. This point's easily proved by looking at how gender or binary gender identities and the expectations attached to them have shifted over the last century. A really basic example that I like to use with my students sometimes is the idea of clothing trends and notions of female modesty or propriety, right? It used to be really scandalous for women to wear certain types of clothing, including pants. And it's now a widely accepted behavior. So this is just a really basic example that shows how gendered expectations have been made malleable throughout history, right? They're always changing in response to our social condition, our social systems. So when you're encountering words or terms that have gendered meanings, such as words like mother, daughter, son, aunt, uncle, remember to be very careful about detaching these gendered social roles from any expectations of what that person might look like or what their body looks like. If you're faced with using a gendered term, but you're not really sure how the subject identifies, find a gender neutral term. It's almost always available, right? So if you don't know if you should refer to a parent as a mother or a father, just call them a parent, right? Use the gender neutral term when you're unsure. So some more suggestions here. Avoid gendered language when speaking abstractly. So if you know a person's preferred term and that's a gendered term, certainly you should use that. But when you're speaking abstractly, or if you don't know, really focus on modifying your language to be gender neutral. So in general addresses, maybe when you're greeting your class at the beginning of a period, right? Instead of saying things like guys or ladies and gentlemen, try instead folks or scholars or guests or writers, whatever the appropriate gender neutral term might be. It may seem very inclusive to say ladies and gentlemen, but what you're doing in that moment is you're reinforcing this idea of a gender binary, right? That there are only ladies or gentlemen in your audience. So be conscious of that. Don't question the self-identification of students or colleagues or of figures in the material that you're teaching. So again, this just goes back to trusting individuals to be the expert of their own experience, right? Another important pedagogical move you can make, and this I think is applicable across disciplines, is to pay critical attention to gender in the texts and the materials that you're teaching, and lead conversations about how gender is being constructed in the material. And I'm not saying that everyone needs to turn into a gender studies teacher here and that the entire content of your course needs to be about gender. But there are certainly ways that you can have conversations about how gender as a system is operating in your course material that will allow your students to think critically about these questions, right? So in something like a literature class or a humanities class, that might look like saying something like, this character seems to feel turmoil about her role in this relationship. Is gender playing a role here, right? What expectations are being put on this character? It might look different for a STEM course, and I am not a STEM expert, so bear with me here. But acknowledging variations in bodies, in biological makeup, and also bringing identity into the equation is a really important pedagogical tool for including trans and non-binary folks in your conversations. And just a note here, it's really also important to include trans writers and scholars and researchers in your course material, but avoid creating a system where you're treating the trans experience like this great thought experiment, right? Avoid continually othering trans folks while you're doing that. So it's a bit of a delicate balance there, but definitely possible. Okay. So again, did I do first pronouns there? Hold on one second for me. There we go. Normalize singular they. So one thing I hear from a lot of cis folks who really want to make their classrooms safer for trans folks is that they want to know and they want to use their students' correct pronouns, but they're afraid of doing more harm by asking, right? They don't know when it's too intrusive or too personal to ask. So some questions. How do you know what pronouns to use? Is it intrusive to ask people for their pronouns? And does it further marginalize trans people? First, again, just to reiterate, we can't know someone's pronouns by looking at them, right? So you might be able to guess correctly sometimes, but ask yourself when you are making those guesses or those assumptions, whether or not you're being informed by a cis-sexist system, right? A system that draws those lines between biology and gender in a way that's not always applicable. Of course, you know, I can't speak for everyone, none of us can. Everyone will have their own feelings and opinions about the pronoun question, but generally it's much preferred to ask quietly and respectfully for someone's pronouns than it is to continually misgender them or make assumptions about what their pronouns are. So there are certainly ways to ask your class for their pronouns. It's very important that you're asking everyone for their pronouns, not just students that you perceive to be non-binary or trans, right? And all this goes into this issue of normalizing singular they as well, right? So we use singular they all the time. It has been part of our language system for a very long time. I have some examples here. The administrative assistant called. They said to call them back. You don't know the gender of the administrative assistant. You don't know what pronouns they use, so you use they, right? Again, before students submit their papers, they should edit carefully for grammar and spelling. Where is Andrew? They went to the library, right? We use this pretty continually. So getting into the habit of using they as a singular pronoun is absolutely essential to supporting students who use they, them as pronouns, but also essential for understanding that you can't assume someone's pronouns, right? Even if you think their name is a vaguely gendered name. Another good teaching tip here, don't use gendered language to call on students. I don't know how applicable this is in our Zoom world now, because you have access to everyone's names pretty easily. If you're on Zoom, you can just hover over. But in a face-to-face setting, it's much more preferable to say something like, the person in blue in the back row, as opposed to the woman in the back, right? Because you don't know how that person identifies. And maybe you say the woman in the back and that person identifies as a woman and it's fine, but maybe they don't. And maybe they spend the rest of the class feeling very uncomfortable because they were misgendered in front of a lot of people. So keeping that in mind is really important. All right. Just one more note on that last slide. Do be sure to practice using singular they, right? Practice using it when you're in class and you're talking about a writer or a scholar that you're all reading together and you don't know their gender. Use a gender neutral pronoun. It'll help you get into the habit of using singular they, and it will also signal to your students not only what the best practice is, but that they should also start getting in the habit of using they as a singular pronoun. Okay, so now we're going to talk about what happens if you mess up, right? If you don't know someone's pronoun and you assume, or if you know someone's pronoun and you screw it up, right? And in this particular workshop, webinar, we're going to assume that the misgendering that you might accidentally do is in fact accidental and unintentional, right? If you are intentionally misgendering someone, that's another conversation we need to have on another platform. So misgendering is incorrectly referring to a person's gender by assuming their gender identity or using incorrect pronouns. Misgendering someone can be done intentionally or unintentionally, but it has long-lasting harmful impacts. So some of these impacts might show up in your classroom, right? An unwillingness to engage or speak in class, a fear of group work or presentations, appearing disinterested or bored, academic insecurity, and feeling unable to reach out to teachers for assistance. So it's really important to create a relationship with students in which they feel that they can approach you and ask you for the support that they need to succeed. And if you're continually misgendering someone, or if you misgender someone and respond inappropriately, you're really damaging that potential relationship that you have with that student. So what do you do in the moment if this happens? Very first thing, calm your own defenses, right? Do not automatically jump to, being highly defensive of your own mistake. Instead, take a breath, get calm, and then engage with the student, right? Apologize, acknowledge that you made a mistake. That's very important. Take responsibility for the misgendering. But don't do it by assuring students that you didn't intend to misgender them. At this point, it doesn't matter, right? Your intention, while it matters to you and it matters to how you see yourself interacting with students, the harm has been done for that individual student. And you don't want to get into a situation in which you're asking the student to make you feel better for your own mistake, right? So calming your defenses, apologizing without, saying, I didn't mean to, I never do this. You don't want to go that route. Just say, I'm so sorry, I really messed up, right? If the student or an ally has corrected you, express gratitude for that correction. Say, thank you for letting me know, right? Let the student know that you are open and willing to hear criticism, right? And that you're going to do your best to do better. So in that case, then commit to doing better. And that's more than just saying, I'm not going to do that again, or feeling bad about it, right? You actually have to take some steps to make sure that you don't make that mistake again. Some of those steps might be practicing out loud, right? You might practice using the correct pronoun out loud when you're not in front of that student. You might write it down or make a note for yourself on your roll sheet or on a student profile, something like that. However you have to do it, take those steps to make sure that you won't make that mistake again. It's not the end of the world, but it can be a really traumatic experience for a trans or non-binary student. So really do your best to make them feel as though you are someone they can trust and an ally that they can come to if they want to talk more about it. All right, challenge number 4. Avoid conflating bodies and identities. So one important strategy that will allow you to modify your language and be more inclusive here is to remind yourself that bodies do not correlate to specific identities, right? So in the same way you can't know someone's gender by looking at them or someone's pronouns by reading their name out loud on your roll sheet, generalizing gendered groups and drawing connections between assigned sex and gender identity contributes to something that we call oppositional sexism, right? And this is coined by a trans theorist named Julia Serrano. She wrote a really great book called Whipping Girl that I really recommend. And so it's the idea, oppositional sexism is the idea that there are two sexes with two corresponding gender identities, right? So the gender binary, and that those boundaries can't be blurred, right? Serrano writes that oppositional sexism creates the assumption that feminine traits, which occur in members of both sexes, are inexorably linked to female biology and therefore to one another. So it's this idea that the state of being a man or the state of being a woman is mutually exclusive, that you're one or the other, you cannot be both, there's nothing in between or outside of that system. So this is really the core of a lot of our social problems around creating trans inclusive environments, right? Is this idea that there are only two genders and that they are mutually exclusive. So we want to really be active and intentional about disrupting those ideas. So what I want to do next is a little interactive bit here. So I have some sentences that might on the surface seem pretty unproblematic, but each of them really makes some assumptions about who the target of that sentence is and who is included here. So if we could just take about 2 minutes and pick one of these sentences and try to find a way to replace the gendered term with something more inclusive here. So I'm just going to give everyone a minute to do that, and then I'll take a look at the chat and see if anyone wants to share. Okay, we'll start now.
Oh, cervixes. What the fuck?
Someone is not muted. Right, we already got a couple of suggestions here. If you have suggestions for either of these three sentences, go ahead and put them in the chat. So for time's sake, let's go ahead and start talking about the first one, but go ahead and keep putting those suggestions in the chat if you have them and you feel comfortable. So the first sentence, women grow up being taught to accommodate others' needs. So we have a very specific term here, right? Women grow up being taught to accommodate others' needs. There's a couple different ways we might be able to make this a little bit more inclusive. You might say instead assigned female at birth, right? So folks who are assigned female grow up being taught to accommodate others' needs. This change here to say someone who's, you know, socialized or assigned female or perceived as a woman, right, accommodates a whole range of folks who may have been subject to this phenomenon, growing up being taught to accommodate others' needs, but may no longer identify as women. So that's a good first option here. I see we have a couple suggestions for number 2. So number 2 is all women need access to cervical cancer screenings. And we have 2 suggestions here, all those with cervixes and AFAB people, assigned female at birth. Both of these are really good, right? I might recommend something more along the lines of all those with cervixes need access to cervical cancer screenings. I think both are good options, but what all those with cervixes kind of does for us in this position is it really takes out the idea of assigning, right? Assigning any sort of gendered category to a person, and just really talking about the core of the sentence there, which is folks with cervixes, right, who need cervical cancer screenings. So really, really nice job there. And then number 3, men are socialized to be more aggressive due to perceived ideas about their hormonal and chromosomal makeup. And we got a nice suggestion here, people raised as men. That's a really good option, right? Because we're talking about socialization and how people are socialized from childhood forward. So that indicates that you're accounting for folks who were raised and socialized as men, but may no longer identify as men. So nice job there. Anyone have anything else they'd like to add to these options? Let's see if I can get faces on here again. Participants? Nope, that's not it. Okay, that's okay. All right, so we can always return to this in the Q&A if anyone has further questions about that. I'm going to go ahead and go on to the next slide for time's sake. So again, on the same challenge, avoid conflating bodies and identities, right? So we really want to avoid using euphemisms when talking about bodies, because euphemisms are so often gendered in nature that they really work to reinforce that connection between sex and gender. So one important example is the almost ubiquitous use of feminine products when describing menstrual care, right? So it may seem like a really small issue to many cis folks, but for some, the use of a gendered term to describe something that's really necessary for their bodily hygiene, regardless of gender, is deeply connected to systems of gendered oppression. So the trend of saying feminine products is connected to our society's fear and dismissal of menstruation as an equity issue, right? Periods are stigmatized because they have been thought of as women's issues. And female bodies have been historically oppressed and shrouded in euphemism. So it's really important to use anatomically correct terms here, both to sort of combat this, fear of talking about menstruation, but also to include folks who menstruate who don't identify as women. So that's a really important equity issue that goes along with conversations we might have about bathroom issues and things like that, which we'll talk a little bit more about in a minute. Having a bit of a problem here, so give me just 1 second. See if I can figure out how to. Okay, well maybe I can't, so I'll just proceed this way. All right. All right, so the next thing I want to talk about in terms of creating trans-inclusive classrooms is really changing the culture of the university and of our departments, right? And so it's really important to be an ally to trans and non-binary folks, especially when you're having conversations with your colleagues. So first off, challenge binary assumptions of gender in conversations with colleagues, with students, with anyone that you're working with in a professional capacity. This means, and it doesn't mean you have to be super combative, right? It doesn't mean that you have to fight with people all the time. That's not what we're asking you to do. But it does mean kindly and respectfully calling attention to comments that either intentionally or unintentionally reinforce the idea of the universal gender binary. So assume that you have trans students in your classrooms. You almost certainly do. You may not know that you do. Even if you don't, right? Model those best practices for your peers and for peers of trans students. It's really important. Learning about trans scholars in your field and then allow that knowledge to really shape what you decide to teach, right? So encourage your colleagues to do the same. Sometimes this might actually look like talking about trans issues in classrooms. Sometimes this just looks like I don't know, maybe you're teaching STEM, or maybe you're teaching political science, and maybe gender isn't part of the conversation. But you want to make sure that you're being as inclusive as possible in the writers, scholars, researchers that you choose to include in your curriculum. This means including trans and non-binary folks. This means including people of color. This means including women, right? Really trying to create a diverse and inclusive syllabi is important. Another thing that you can do at the sort of department level is advocate for trans inclusive content in department trainings and guidelines. So encourage your department to make a public statement about trans inclusion. That doesn't always mean that your department will then follow suit and live up to that public declaration, but at least you have something to hold them accountable to, some written document. Advocate for pronoun introductions as a regular department practice. So not only in your classrooms, but also in department meetings and in orientations and things like that. Encourage your colleagues to be aware of the location of gender neutral restrooms near their class locations. This is really important. Not only does this signal to your students that you care about them and are aware of their existence, right? But if you find out that your university does not have any gender neutral restrooms located near your classroom site, this is something you should bring up to administration, right? And finally, help your less knowledgeable colleagues respect their trans students. So now I want to do just a really brief writing exercise, and we're going to work off of this scenario. And so I'm going to read the scenario out loud. And then I want everyone to just take a minute or two and think about how you might respond. And I'd like to share some of your responses if you feel comfortable. So either volunteer and you can unmute your mic, or post it in the chat and I'd be happy to read it anonymously. So here's the scenario. You're having drinks with a colleague. They say, I have a student who wants me to start calling her by a different name and use they, them pronouns instead of her. She still looks like a woman, and it's really hard to use they, especially when she doesn't look any different. Maybe I can just avoid using pronouns at all. It's so stressful, I don't know why she's being complicated. So take a moment, think about how you might respond in your capacity as an ally to trans people, and then let's share our responses. We'll take a minute and a half or so to brainstorm that. Take another 30 seconds or so. All right, does anyone want to share what strategy they might use to respond to this colleague? Any hands up? All right, great. We have someone in the chat. So Betsy, it's our goal to be respectful to all and to create a supportive learning environment for all students. If using they, them pronouns and a different name supports the student's well-being and comfort in the course, it seems an easy thing to do. That's a really nice response, right? That's a very, it's not too combative, right? It's not going to put the person on their defenses immediately, but it is going to let them know that actually you think that this is a fairly reasonable request, right? A fairly simple thing to do to support your student. So really good job there. Anyone else have anything they want to share or any questions about how to respond to this particular situation? Good. Okay, so we've got another one. Have you ever been misgendered? Talk to them about how hurtful and traumatic it can be. Also, a really good approach, right? Make clear the stakes of the situation, right? Make clear that it's not just someone feeling like they want to be complicated, right? It's someone really asking you to respect them as a person. Good job. Okay, we've got another one. When responding to this colleague, set an example by making sure to only refer to the student with the correct pronouns. Very important, right? You'll notice in the excerpt, the colleague is still using she, her pronouns instead of they, them, which is the student's correct pronouns. So no matter what the content of your response, just observing and using the correct pronouns can be a really good way to let this colleague know that actually you should be using they, them to refer to this person. Really nice suggestions here. Anyone else have anything they want to share? All right, great. So we're going to move on to the next slide, but these are really, really nice approaches to that conversation. Okay. All right, so now I promise we're almost done. I know this is lengthy, but now we just have a couple more slides with some suggestions here for some syllabus language. And so this is applicable to virtual teaching as well. Make sure that you include and disclose your pronouns. So when I write a syllabus, I always put my pronouns next to my name. When I introduce myself to a class, I always introduce myself and say, my name is Jamie, and I use she and her pronouns. And doing this, no matter what your gender identity is, signals to your students, one, that you're aware of pronouns as a thing that is not always obvious or visible on the body, right? And two, it can help your students feel more comfortable disclosing their pronouns to you. So make sure that this is on your documentation. You can also add this to your Zoom profile. So if you mouse over, well, I don't know if it'll work on, if you mouse over my face, you should see Jamie, parentheses, she/her cook, right? And so you can edit this in your Zoom profile to include your pronouns. I'm not super familiar with the Google version of Zoom, but I imagine there's a way to do it there as well. So add this to your Zoom profile, your online class platform, and also your email signature. What I've done in my email signature, which is super helpful, is link to the RCSGD's webpage on pronouns. So if someone sees my signature and sees she, her, and then next to it, it says, what's this, ? You can click on that and it can take them to a resource that can help them educate themselves on what it means to use pronouns responsibly and effectively. So if you're not from UCSB, check out your campus's LGBTQ Resource Center. If your campus doesn't have an LGBTQ Resource Center, or if you are a K-12 teacher, check out some community resources. And if you have any questions, feel free to email me and I'm happy to help you find those resources. Another important thing for your syllabus is make clear your expectations really early on. So I like to put something in my syllabus that kind of falls under a community guideline, right? So the example I have here is, all students have the right to a respectful learning environment. Please refrain from making transphobic comments and refer to your classmates with the appropriate pronouns. If you don't know your classmates' pronouns, kindly and privately ask. This is one option. You can also have language that's a little bit broader, which I typically do for a syllabus. I'll say, please refrain from making transphobic, homophobic, sexist, or racist comments, right? So having something, I know we all joke about how students don't like to read our syllabi, but having something that you can refer them back to if you do have an issue and say, actually, this is in our class agreement, this is on our syllabus. Maybe you can read over that and think about that a little bit more, can be helpful. And again, creating those resource pages. not all students, maybe 90% of students won't pay attention to them, but if even 1 or 2 do, you've done a good thing in providing those resources. Okay. In my last slide, which this is a question that I got a couple times on the RSVP form, and so I'm going to do my best to talk through this. Part of creating trans-inclusive classrooms is doing your job as a teacher, right? To make sure that you're modifying your language and being inclusive. Part of it is also conflict management between your students, right? So how can you address transphobia in the classroom if a student makes a transphobic comment about another student or just in general, right? So some general advice here. Make your expectations very clear regarding the transphobic remarks from the beginning. So that goes back to that syllabus language and having that conversation in class. Number 2, intervene if a student makes a transphobic comment or misgenders another student, regardless of whether or not you think it's intentional, right? So do this when it happens. This is a really important part of supporting trans students, right? And one way that you might approach this too is to talk to the student who has been harmed by the language and ask, if you don't know what to do in that moment, ask them what they'd like you to do in the future. But for many trans and non-binary people, even something like misgendering, having to correct someone over and over and over again is really emotionally stressful, right? It's harmful to them. And so if you can act as an intermediary in that position, for a lot of folks, that's helpful. And 3, don't wait until a blatantly transphobic comment is made, right? Incorporate this language modification and encourage your students to question their assumptions about gender throughout the course, right? Make it a daily practice. Think about this continually, not just when someone says something problematic, right? And then some general intervention language here. And if anyone is interested in having this language at hand, I'm happy to send out this material afterwards. I split this into microaggressive and macroaggressive comments because I do think that they provide different opportunities for intervention. If there's a sort of macroaggressive comment, so something that you might perceive as a smaller comment or something that's maybe not explicitly transphobic, but implicitly transphobic, this could be a really good learning moment for your students, right? So you might say something like, maybe we can stop for a minute and think about why that comment might reinforce some of these transphobic assumptions. If they've misgendered a writer or someone that is not immediately a student in your class, but someone you're speaking about, you might say, actually, this writer uses they, them pronouns or she, her pronouns or whatever the writer's pronouns are. Let's be sure we respect that, right? These can be some easy interventions that don't, super disrupt the flow of your class, but makes it clear that you're really trying to create a trans-inclusive environment. Macroaggressive comments, right? Something that is blatantly transphobic, probably violent in some way, rhetorically violent in some way. That's something that you really need to intervene in the moment, right? So you might say something like, that statement was unacceptable. It contributes to transphobia. Do not repeat it, right? You might be a little bit more forceful in that. If it continues or if it's particularly bad, right? You might say, this classroom should be a safe space for everyone. If you continue to make comments like this, you're going to have to leave, right? And so none of us want to be that person in our class. None of us want to ask students to leave class because of whatever behavior. But in these cases, you really need to think about the safety of your trans students in the classroom, right? You can't promise a safe environment because you can't control what everyone says all the time, but you can show them that you're an ally and that you're willing to intervene when necessary. So I recommend doing that. And then as a final note for me, just make sure you have support, right? If you don't feel that you have a colleague or a supervisor or a professor who can support you, find community support. If you're at UCSB, the RCSGD is a great place to go. If you're elsewhere, there are community resources, there are online resources, and we're always happy to talk with you. All right, I'm gonna turn it back over to Sam to close us out now.
Yeah, so this kind of goes back to what's going on at the ground level, right? So It's important to recognize that trans students, their daily, and cis students, every student, their daily encounter with empowerment and oppression on college campuses happens at the ground level. So that means that it requires ground level interventions. There's a citation here which you can access, or I guess if we send out the slides, maybe you can access it. So this person is advocating for greater attention to assessing and transforming what she calls campus microclimates. And that is your offices, your TA office, your residential buildings, academic departments, and other areas of campus that students interact with on a daily basis. So I want you to think about this. I want you to think about, like, how are you communicating to your students that you are an ally? Like Jamie was saying before, or maybe it was Eugene, I'm not sure. Your students can't assume that you're an ally. Your students can't assume that you have this knowledge. So how can you communicate that to them so that they know that they can talk to you about these things, and so that you're creating a climate that's accessible to them? How do you do this in your office? Like, what kind of things can you have in your office that when a student comes by, they're going to see that and they're going to say, okay, this person understands where I'm coming from, understands my identity, and this makes me want to engage with them. And how can you do this in your classroom and through your interactions with students, whether it be email, your syllabus, like all of these things that Jamie was mentioning. These are all things that give that signal to students that you're somebody who understands and who has this knowledge, and they can approach you about this. And so I'm just going to read out this quote. So it says, understanding and eliminating oppression and inequality obliges us to examine our relative privilege, to move out of our internalized positions as victims, and to take control over our lives, and to take responsibility for change. Such an undertaking is by definition risky, and therefore requires commitment to a different vision of society than that which we now take for granted. So this is really speaking to people who have some kind of privilege, and to not just, it's not just an intellectual exercise, right? Like, this requires action, and it is risky by definition. But this is doing that thing for your trans students that's going to make them be more involved in the classroom, be wanting to participate, and it's ultimately has the most impact for them. So I think we can just reiterate some of these things that we've been talking about. Take note of the language that you're using. Be conscious about that. Be conscious about the choices that you're making. Incorporate trans people and trans perspectives into your teaching. Speak out when you witness cis sexism or transphobia in the classroom and outside of it. You know, you don't have to stop at the classroom. If you witness somebody saying something problematic, you can say something. And model behavior for your students by noting your pronouns and respecting others. Address your own cis sexism seriously and often. So you can start with yourself, right? Like, how am I contributing to this, and what kind of changes can I make to make that impact? Familiarize yourself with resources for trans and non-binary students on campus. This is really important. If you have a trans student who comes to you and they want to ask you about resources, do you know where to go? Recognize that cisgender discomfort is and must be part of addressing cis sexism and transphobia in education and beyond. Yeah, so I've heard sometimes people say, like, it's hard for me to remember how to use they, them pronouns. And that part of discomfort is going to be something that, as you practice and as you do it more, like, the discomfort is going to lessen. but that doesn't mean it necessarily will go away altogether, but that's part of growth, right? And we have to remember that learning is not a passive activity. We don't learn by osmosis. We don't learn by just hearing things. Like, we have to practice. So part of that discomfort is part of addressing these things. And lastly, show up for your trans students by listening and offering your advocacy. So this is a huge thing, to let them know that they're not on their own, and that you're there and you're showing up for them to help them out.
Awesome. Okay, thank you so much for that, Sam. All right, so I'm going to go ahead and stop screen sharing. And Eugene, if you want to end the recording now.